This is Dr. Buffano with another lecture on Middle East politics. We're going to begin our last unit of the semester, which is going to be on the Arab Spring. Now, what was the Arab Spring? It was a wave of revolutions that started in the country of Tunisia at the end of 2010 and then swept across much of the region in the following year, spreading to Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, Libya, Syria, and other countries. It led to mass protests. In some cases, it led to civil wars. In others, it led to attempted democratic transitions. It upended the region in a great number of ways. And these sets of revolutions were influenced by both political ideals as well as economic grievances. And those political ideals were specifically influenced by liberalism and support for democracy. These revolutions were seeking to overthrow autocratic regimes. And so in this lecture, we're going to learn why it is that democracy, support for it, support for democracy became so widespread in the region right before 2010. So let's get to it. I'm going to share my screen with all of you. We're also in this lecture as well, we're going to be looking at quite a bit of polling data just to provide some evidence for the conclusions I'm going to make here. So we've got a couple of major goals here. Number one, we want to understand the ideological roots of the Arab Spring, meaning the changes in ideas that inspired people to not only revolt against their governments, but to support democratic transitions in the process. And in order to do this, we have to analyze polling data to look at attitudes towards democracy, as well as things like political Islam and feminism in the Middle East. And I think you're going to be surprised by this lecture at the amount of people in the Middle East that support democracy as a form of government. And finally, we're going to understand why support for democracy grew from the 1970s to the 2000s. And so I'm going to go into several case examples. We're going to talk a lot about Egypt, for example, in this lecture, just to kind of understand what happened. Now, of course, one of the things we have to establish here is that support for democracy was a big part of these revolutions. It's one of the main reasons why people gathered together in squares in places like Cairo, Tunis, and elsewhere throughout the region. I myself lived through the Arab Spring in Egypt, and I was there for when the revolution happened in the ensuing years. And in Tahrir Square, there were people holding up all sorts of signs and chanting for democracy, right? So one of the things they wanted was to overthrow their dictatorships and support democratic transitions in the process. So the Arab Spring, in many ways, involved these kind of pro-democracy movements. Okay, and so across the region, you end up having mass protest movements from the end of 2010 all the way through 2013 for the next couple of years. So we could see here that the Arab Spring touched almost the entire region. Now, there were some countries that were affected by it more than others. Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Yemen, Syria witnessed extreme amounts of political instability. In some cases, like Syria, civil war. So in order to be able to have this discussion, we have to first define what exactly is democracy, right? So what is it that these people were supporting here? Well, a democracy, just to give you a kind of academic standard textbook procedural definition, it's any type of political system where you have competitive elections to determine who will control the government, the legislative and executive branches. Now, these elections, they have to be free and fair, right? So there has to be actual competition to determine who has power. Now, in a more general kind of, the popular definition of democracy, democracy does mean rule by the people, okay? And since in a country of millions of people, you can't have direct democracy where everybody gets to participate in the making of laws, the way we deal with this in the modern world is we have people vote for their representatives. And those representatives, in turn, will represent the voters within the legislative and executive branches. Now, in order to have free and fair elections, though, several key things are needed. Number one, you need to have near universal suffrage amongst adult citizens, right? So you cannot exclude the vast swath of the population from participating. This was actually a big problem in a lot of early democracies in places like the United States and Great Britain, where only white male landowners could vote in those systems. Of course, in today's democracies, women can now vote, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, so you can't exclude large swaths of the population from participation. So that's one key aspect of democracy. Now, number two, you also need to have support for things like civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of assembly, right? If I'm in the opposition trying to get my candidates elected to office, well, I can't do that if I can't speak openly against the government, if I can't express my opposition and support alternative candidates, nor can I compete with the government in power if I can't form my own political party, if I can't engage in protest or start a media campaign. And of course, these civil liberties also involve the ability to speak about sensitive issues regarding things like religion, for example. So without those basic civil liberties, you cannot have a democracy. The state has to protect people's rights to freedom of speech. You cannot arbitrarily throw individuals in prison. Now, part of this as well involves a protection of civil rights. Minorities within the community have to be protected from mass discrimination, whether by the state itself or by people in the population. Otherwise, they won't be able to get an education, compete economically or politically, and participate in civil society. So the rights of the minorities have to be protected, whether we're talking about women, ethnic, or racial minorities. These are all critical aspects of a democracy. And of course, when thinking about democracy like this, you can think of democracy versus dictatorship on a sliding scale, with some countries being more democratic than others. Okay. Some countries like North Korea are on one far end of the spectrum where they are completely totalitarian and there is no freedom. Whereas other countries like Finland, Sweden, and Norway have very free and relatively equal political and economic systems. Now, on top of this as well, in order to have a democracy, you also need the rule of law. All politicians, regardless of who they are, have to be subjected to the laws in the same way as the average citizen is. Okay, there has to be equality under the law. The laws have to apply to everybody. If the person who is the president or the prime minister, that is the head of government, can abuse their power without facing any consequences, well, this will lead to corruption, and that person in power will be able to rig elections in any way they see fit. Everybody has to be subjected to the law. In order to have this, you also need to have an independent judiciary. You can't have an executive that can arbitrarily fire judges and replace them with their own lackeys, right? This could seriously weaken the independence of the courts and hurt the rule of law in the system. So this is something that's also critical. Now, a couple of other things about democracy. Okay, there's also more substantive definitions of democracy that involve conditions that make democracies more stable, and they also involve as well conditions that make it more likely for democratic institutions to emerge in a country. So democratic consolidation in part involves when you have high levels of popular support for democratic institutions such as elections, democratically elected legislatures, and so on and so forth, as well as support for democratic norms such as support for freedom of speech and support for democratic consensus, right? Engaging in compromise and debate as opposed to political violence. If you have greater support for democracy, this will give more stability to democratic institutions. And on top of that, if you're in a situation where you live in a dictatorship, if there's growing levels of support for democracy, this will make it more likely for both democratic revolutions as well as democratic transitions to take place. And of course, by the way, you're also more likely to have democratic consolidation when there's higher levels of economic equality in society, because this will create more equal levels of power, right? The farther the wealth gap between the rich and poor, and the more people that live in poverty, the harder it is to consolidate democracy because the very few, in terms of the wealthy, will end up dominating the political system. Now, what exactly is the level of support in the Arab world for such political systems, for systems with elections and for support for democratic norms? Well, let's analyze the polling data. Now, before I show you the polling data, I just want to briefly mention it comes from this institution called the Arab Barometer. Ever since the mid to late 2000s, this institution has been engaging in all sorts of polls across the Arab world. In fact, their website is found here, www.arabbarometer.org. You could find all sorts of information on popular attitudes towards all sorts of issues, not just democracy, but all sorts of stuff. And this is much better than just guessing at what people believe in the Middle East or just believing whatever political activist or dictator says people believe, right? So looking at data could help us understand actual attitudes towards democracy. So what conclusions can we make from this data? Let's take a look at it. All right, so here's the data. Okay, so we're going to briefly analyze it here. Now, what is this data showing? Well, a series of surveys were done from 2010 to 2011, right before or right at the beginning of the Arab Spring. And so this gives us a good idea as to what people were believing right before these revolutions broke out. And several questions were asked in the survey. One of the questions was, do you believe that democracy is the best form of government? Right? So if you said yes, okay, you were considered as being in support of democracy. Now, other questions that were asked were, do you believe that religious officials, religious clerics, the ulama, religious scholars, should play a role in government? And so this would let us know, is the person a political Islamist? That is, somebody who supports the mixing of religion and politics, okay? Now, what we want to know from these two questions is A, how many people support democracy versus dictatorship? B, how many people are secular and support democracy? C, how many people are secular and support authoritarianism? D, how many people are Islamist and support democracy? And then finally, how many are Islamists and support authoritarianism? Well, the data might surprise you. Take a quick look. I even recommend pausing it and just kind of looking at the data here. Number one, the vast majority of people in the region support democracy over authoritarianism. According to this data, the average, okay, only about 20% of people on average or less in these countries supports authoritarianism. Okay, that's number one. Number two, about 80%, in some countries even more, support democracy. That is a very high level of support, okay? And so, to understand the Arab Spring, okay, these mass protests with millions of people that came out into the streets in support of democracy, we have to know what people actually believe. So despite the kind of stereotypes promoted by Orientalists, in today's Islamic world and today's Middle East, there's actually widespread support for democracy, okay? We actually find this with Muslims in the United States too, very high levels of support for democratic institutions. Now, here's the thing though. About half, a little less than half, actually, of those who support democracy, okay, also support democracy with Islamic influence, meaning these people are Muslim Democrats. Okay, kind of like the center right in the United States with the Republican Party or Christian Democrats in Europe, meaning they support democracy, but their religious values influence how they how they see politics and what type of political reforms they want, right? So these are people that, for example, are usually opposed to abortion, opposed to LGBTQ rights. They often want Sharia law to be the basis of law. And oftentimes as well, they want religious clerics to play a greater role within politics, right, to influence the political system. And so this is kind of similar to how many Republicans in the United States want the churches, and they want religious figures as well as those influenced by Christianity to have positions of government, right? So this is very similar here. Now, approximately the other half, though, are secular. They don't want religious officials influencing the states. They are more in favor of secular governments. Now, what should also be surprising here is that amongst authoritarians, it's also relatively split. There are secularists that support authoritarianism and Islamists that support authoritarianism. So about 20% of the population, and it's split in half between Islamists and secularists. What this is showing is that not only is there widespread support for democracy, but even amongst Islamists. And this could also help us explain why there was growing support for political Islam from the 1970s to the 2000s, but also growing support for democracy. Okay, so the two are not necessarily contradicting. I highly recommend watching my previous lecture on Muslim Democrats to understand more about that. All right, so that's some of the basic data. I do want to show you one other thing here. Let's scroll down. Here it is, attitudes towards women. Something that also might surprise you, okay? There are a majority, the vast majority of people in the region, about 70%, okay, between 60 and 70%, depending on the country, support the idea that a woman can be a prime minister or the president of a country. And the vast majority of people as well support women gaining access to an education. And even many Islamists support this throughout the region. So this is something else that is critical to understand here. There's growing support for women's rights as well within the system and for women's participation in government. In fact, many Muslim democratic parties throughout the Middle East, such as Ennahda, for example, in Tunisia, have in the past run female candidates for office, have female leaders within the party. This is important to understand if we are to understand these Muslim democratic parties as well as the nature of the Arab Spring. Okay, so that is my analysis of the Arab Spring. So in conclusion here, the majority of people by 2010 were in support of democracy. Now, why the growing support? Well, a couple of things about the region. First, the support for liberal social movements, if you watched a prior lecture, it goes all the way back to the mid to late 19th century, right? So it goes back to the beginnings of European influence on the region during the 1800s. So this is not something that's completely new. However, there was a rapid growth in the amount of support for democracy from the 1970s to the 2000s, more recently in history, during a period in global history known as the third wave of democratization. Now, what was this wave of democratization? Well, it was a period in which democracy spread to about half of the countries across the globe. Prior to this time period, most of the democracies were found in Western Europe, North America, Australia, and a few other places. But during this wave, democracy started to spread to Eastern Europe, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And because of the spread of democracy in many parts of the globe, it led to the spread of democratic norms and support for democracy, even in places that didn't become democratic during this time period. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that you see during this time period, the decline of Soviet Union and communism, that single party form of dictatorship, and the rise of US global hegemony. Okay, so we see the spread of Western political influence and soft power, as well as globalization, when the world was becoming more economically and socially interconnected. So because of the spread of democracy to many countries, we also see the spread of democratic ideals in many parts of the globe, okay, including within the dictatorships of the Middle East during this era. So part of this has to do with the emergence of mass media, the spread of satellite television, for example, and television networks like CNN, Al Jazeera, and so on and so forth. Okay, the spread of the internet. Okay, and so we see that growing numbers of individuals getting access to the internet, cell phones. We also see as well the spread of films and music across the internet that expose people to life in these various democracies, and particularly to life in Western Europe and the United States. A lot of my students, for example, listen to music that came from the United States. They listened to Metallica, Rage Against the Machine. They were listening to all sorts of different forms of music, as well as watching films, right? That, if you watch, for example, a television show where you have a woman that's in a position of power, leading running a hospital or serving in a position of government, well, this could influence your attitudes towards the world, right? So people became exposed to all sorts of media during this era within the Middle East that started shifting their attitudes towards the world. Now, on top of this, we also had as well growing migration from the Middle East to other parts of the world due to globalization. Many people went to Europe and the United States and Canada seeking an education, seeking work, and in some cases seeking political asylum. And by living in these countries, not only were they often sending money back to their relatives, but they were also being exposed to these democracies and the values of these different countries, and in turn were sometimes returning to their home countries and influencing their friends, their neighbors back at home. So this mass migration due to globalization, this is going to have a big effect on the peoples of these regions. Now, on top of this as well, the United States and the European Union were also trying to influence these countries' political systems, not only trying to promote capitalism and free markets, we talked about this in a previous lecture, but also trying to encourage electoral reforms. They were giving out aid, they were helping to establish new schools and universities and public works programs, investing in water and sewage and electricity and other economic development programs. And on top of that, they were giving aid to NGOs that were promoting democracy throughout the region. So while, of course, there was a lot of hypocrisy during this era from the United States and the EU, some of this aid did go to went to dictatorships. Some of it was in the form of military aid to countries like Egypt. A lot of the aid was also, though, directed towards political and economic development, such as democracy promotion. So that's part of the reason. Part of it has to do with these global dynamics, the global spread of democracy, globalization, and the spread of Western soft power. Now, part of it as well had to do with the domestic changes within these regimes, within these countries from the 70s to the 2000s. We learned in a prior lecture that during this time period, a lot of the Arab republics, like Egypt, like Tunisia, began to move away from single party dictatorships where no opposition was allowed to electoral authoritarianism where a limited opposition was allowed, where some opposition parties were allowed to exist, where some NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and some opposition trade unions were allowed to exist. And as a consequence of this allowed for the emergence of opposition parties that supported democracy. That is liberalism, right? Support for capitalism, support for the existence of free and fair elections. And on top of this, a lot of new NGOs are going to emerge during this time period that are going to promote human rights, for example. They're going to promote feminism and women's equality, as well as the rights of ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities. Many of these groups as well are going to promote diversity and multiculturalism in the process. Some of these NGOs are going to form domestically, and others are going to be transnational NGOs that operate across borders, some originating from Western countries themselves. Now, we're also as well going to see the emergence of social democratic movements, trade union activism, people who support the redistribution of wealth. We'll talk about these groups more next lecture. And finally, we see during this era, and we talked about this last lecture, the emergence of more and more conservative Muslims supporting democracy, conservative Islamists, the emergence of Muslim Democrats in various parts of the region. So because of all these different domestic trends, we see growing support for democracy. By the way, this is just showing you some of the data for some of these claims. So this is looking at the spread of democracy across the world from the 1970s to the 2000s. Okay, we went from having about quarter of the countries in the world being democracies to about half. Okay, so this represented a massive spread of democracy throughout the globe. And by the way, here's just the data on migration. So in the United States today, for example, there are hundreds of thousands of migrants that come from countries all across the Islamic world, from Iraq to Syria to Lebanon to Jordan to Saudi Arabia to Yemen to Kuwait to Egypt to Morocco and so on and so forth, right? And because of this, in today's world, about 1% of America's population consists of Muslims. And so this has then enabled the diffusion of ideas such as democracy into the Middle East. And on top of that as well, for those who never left the Middle East, they became exposed to Western culture, not only because of their relatives going abroad, but because of increased internet usage. See, in some countries like Kuwait, internet usage is almost 100%. And even in some of the poorest countries in the region, such as Yemen, over 60% of people have access to the internet. So growing internet and cell phone usage has connected the world more. Now, here's the thing, though. Despite the spread of democracy, in terms of the spread of democratic norms in the Middle East, the reality is that up until 2010, just about all of the regions, okay, of the Middle East, I'm sorry, just about all the countries of the Middle East were dictatorships, okay? There are a few exceptions to this. So Israel is a democracy. It has competitive elections for its parliament, okay? Although, of course, Israel has massive problems and challenges currently. It's currently occupying the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. It has been occupying fully these regions since 1967. And there's been some democratic backsliding in Israel recently. The far-right Likud party has been centralizing power within Israel. Now, the only other democracies that have existed or did exist include Turkey. So from 1950 to 2014, the country had various periods where it was a democracy, although it experienced 4 coups d'etats. So 1960, 1971, 1980, and 1997. So there were brief periods of military rule during that period. And since 2014, Turkey has experienced democratic backsliding. Now, on top of that, the only 2 other countries that have any experiences really with competitive elections are Lebanon, which has serious flaws with its democracy since it gained independence from France in 1943. The system itself divides representation in the legislature based on religious confessionalism. So basically, a certain number of seats are reserved for different religious groups in the country: Christians, Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims. And the system is not divided equally. Christians have a disproportionate number of seats in the country's parliament in relation to their actual popular representation in the country. And because of that, there have been all sorts of problems in Lebanon. There was a long civil war in that country from 1975 to 1990 that killed over 100,000 people. The country has been occupied at various points in time by Syria and Israel. It has been bombed at various points in time. Very unstable democracy with a very weak states. Now, the only other country to have competitive elections was Tunisia from 2011 to 2021, and that's after the Arab Spring. So up until 2010, Tunisia was a dictatorship. So this is a poor record of democracy throughout the region. As you can see on this Freedom House map, countries in purple are labeled as not free by Freedom House. So what does this mean? It means in 2010, you had a situation where the vast majority of people, supported democracy, but lived under dictatorships. This is a recipe for severe instability. So as support for democracy grew, you did not see these countries transition to democracy. Now, the question is why did it take so long then for the revolutions to take place? Well, there's a variety of reasons for this. Okay, number one, the dictatorships of the region did adapt to growing support for democracy by making partial reforms. as I said, from the 1970s to the 2000s, the electoral authoritarian regimes in the Arab republics, right, they started to open up their systems to allow an opposition to exist. Now, one of the things that happened during this era is that many of the ruling authoritarian parties, the political parties that ruled these states, began to reframe their identity as being democratic. I put democratic in quotes here because they didn't really allow free and fair elections, but they tried to create the perception that their countries had democracies. So, for example, in Egypt, under Anwar Sadat, he shifted the country from socialism to this kind of electoral authoritarian regime, and he renamed the ruling party the National Democratic Party, which would rule the country all the way up until Egypt's revolution in 2011. So from 1977 to 2011. The same thing happened in Tunisia. So Tunisia was a single party regime from the 50s to the 70s, but in the early 1980s, under Habib Bourguiba, the country started to shift to electoral authoritarianism. And when his successor, Zain al Abidine Ben Ali, took power by 1988, not only did he shift the country more towards capitalism, but he also created an electoral authoritarian regime under his rule, and he created this new party, the Democratic Constitutional Rally. So once again, we see the term democracy within the name of this party. Now, these countries weren't really democracies. They didn't allow true, free, and fair elections, but they did allow an opposition to exist. And by pretending to be democracies, it actually led to, in many ways, a spread of support for democracy, right? Because by legitimizing the concept, you're going to, in fact, inspire more support for it, as well as really give a justification for both the opposition in this countries as well as the international community to pressure the government to make real democratic reforms. So another consequence here is that by partially opening up the system, you're going to give a greater space for opposition liberal parties to exist. They're not going to be able to win elections, but they're going to be allowed to exist in these countries. So in Egypt, for example, we see the emergence in 1977 of the new Waft Party. Now, the Waft Party had actually existed in Egypt going all the way back to 1919. That was the year in which Egyptians had this anti-colonial revolt against the British. They wanted, during that time period, to send a delegation, that is a waft in Arabic, to the Versailles Conference in France in order to discuss the post-World War I peace settlement. And this waft party, okay, wanted a democratic revolution in Egypt. And after that revolution took place, there was a period in Egypt from the 1920s to the early 1950s where there was a constitutional monarchy where they actually did allow elections with multiple political parties to compete for a legislature. And the Watt Party was one of those political parties. Now, after 1952, when eventually Gamal Abdel Nasser is going to come to power, eventually he's going to create a single party dictatorship, the Watt Party was banned, and many of their members were put into prison. And this would be the case up until the early 1970s. However, once Anwar Sadat came into power, he's going to release many of these liberals from prison, and he's going to allow the Watt Party to become reestablished. And they're going to become the new Watt Party. And this party promoted democracy. They promoted liberalism. And we're going to see similar things in other countries throughout the Middle East. So in Tunisia, for example, under the Ben Ali regime, we're going to see the formation of the Democratic Forum for Labor and Liberties during this time period. It was founded in 1994. And we're going to see, for example, in in Algeria, the Democratic National Rally. That country had transitioned to electoral authoritarianism in 1989. So thus, similar trend here. You notice with these new parties that emerge here, the term democracy is found in all of them. Now, while they were forbidden from winning elections, okay, they did get a minority of seats in these parliaments, and they were able to influence societal attitudes in the process, okay, by campaigning, by influencing the popular discourse. Now, this is the new WAF party here. This is a good image just kind of to show the ideology of this party. They were a secular liberal party. And you might notice with the symbol of the WAF party, we have both a cross representing Egypt's Christian minority and the crescent moon representing Islam. So they were in favor of religious dialogue. They were in favor of secularism as well as democracy. By the way, this is Saad Zaghloul, that leader of the 1919 revolution. And this more modern image here reflects, to the right, reflects how, this inspired many of the youth to really just embrace democracy during this era. And by the way, by allowing some of these new parties to exist, it at least temporarily served as a kind of a way to release pressure from these electoral authoritarian regimes from fully democratizing. And it gave hope to supporters of democracy that over the long term, these countries would eventually become fully democratic. Now, what ended up eventually happening, though, by the 1990s is that many of these activists realized that, hey, these elections are really rigged, and we're not seeing long-term changes to the system. It's impossible for the opposition to win. And so gradually, a lot of these opposition elements that were initially participating in these elections, they grew increasingly frustrated with the slow pace of reforms. Into the 1990s, these countries were still dictatorships, these electoral authoritarian regimes. And so what many activists began to do is they began to move away from participating in elections, and they began to move towards supporting what we call non-governmental organizations, NGOs. These are organizations that are run by citizens outside of state control, and they try to focus on more long-term societal reforms, changing the culture as opposed to the political system directly. Realizing they couldn't really win elections here, many activists by the 1990s started to shift more towards trying to form civil society organizations to peacefully change the culture in the hopes that as more people began to support democracy, this would put greater pressure on these regimes to open the political system. So what we begin to see happening is new NGOs engaging in media campaigns, particularly online where they had more space to do so, to try to influence the political system. So for example, in Tunisia, in 2002, you see the formation of the first pro-LGBTQ rights organization. And because the internet was a freer space, this enabled those activists to engage in that activity. They also as well began to engage in charity, lobbying, and a little later, we begin to see more protesting as well by these groups. And from the 1970s to the 2000s, the number of these NGOs grew in the Arab world, just like in other parts of the world as well. And part of what enabled as well the growth of these NGOs was a combination of Western political pressure as well as globalization and transnational networks. So groups like Amnesty International, which operate across the globe, were able to set up shop in many of these Arab countries and begin to report on human rights abuses and also as well provide a lot of pressure on these regimes to try to make reforms. Now, part of the reason as well for the growing number of NGOs is just the growing frustration with rigged elections from the 1990s and the 2000s. We begin to see more and more people not only boycott these elections, but express their frustrations with the slow pace of reforms. Now, on top of that as well, we begin to see IGOs, international governmental organizations like the UN and the European Union, give support to these NGOs, both verbal support as well as sometimes funding. The United States as well, through its international aid programs, has also given support to NGOs that support democracy. Now, what started to happen, though, as many people began to boycott these elections, as well as participate in NGO activities, well, what these governments began to realize is it represented a threat to their regimes and their survival. So by the late 90s, the 2000s, they began to clamp down on some of these NGOs and place greater and greater restrictions on their activity. We begin to see more activists get thrown in prison by this error, and we begin to see, reforms kind of stall to the disappointment of many activists. And on top of that, many of these governments begin to create what we fake NGOs, that is, non-governmental organizations that are not actually non-governmental organizations. These fake NGOs would often create these fake reports claiming that the regimes were great with human rights, that they were true democracies, when nothing could be farther from the truth. So I often, I jokingly refer to these as non-governmental organizations because they're not really true NGOs. They're just meant to give the appearance of more pluralism than there actually was within these countries. Now, for the NGOs that were able to form during this era, they were able to promote liberal causes like democratization and secularism. So, for example, in 1977, the first domestic human rights organization formed, the Tunisian League for the Defense of Human Rights. They monitored government activity, reporting on human rights abuses, the use of torture in prisons, and other human rights violations in these countries. And they had their copycats. So Egypt, for example, you had activists form the Egyptian Organization for Human Rights in that country. Now, by the way, this is the data. This is looking at the growth of non-governmental organizations, as well as international organizations like the UN, the European Union, and so on and so forth throughout the region. As we could see, the number of these organizations grew exponentially from the 1970s to the 2000s. So this was another source of growing support for democracy in the region. And this would later have a great, by the way, impact on the Arab Spring. The founder of the Tunisian, one of the leaders of the Tunisian League for the Defense of Human Rights was Mansif Marzouki, who would become the first freely elected president of Tunisia in 2011. And he was one of the most outspoken individuals promoting reforms. He was also, for a time period, actually forced into exile, and he would promote democracy abroad for a couple of decades before returning to Egypt in 2011. So he promoted democracy very vigorously, along with many other human rights activists. Now, another thing these NGOs promoted, along with democracy, was multiculturalism and the support for this idea that it's okay to have diversity. It's okay to have diversity of opinions and ideas, to have a diversity of religious beliefs and customs. So we know this is liberal multiculturalism, the support for democracy as well as ethnic diversity, and the support for women's rights as well, right? So you're promoting pluralism here with these movements. And these movements as well, something that's important to know about them is they are very much opposed to both Arab nationalism and political Islamism. They are opposed to this idea that the countries of the Middle East, or specifically the Arab world, are homogeneous in terms of all speaking the Arabic language. The truth is much more complicated than this. Across Arab majority speaking countries, there are tons of ethnic minorities speaking a great variety of different languages. And on top of this as well, these multiculturalists are opposed to this kind of pan-Islamist narrative that all of these countries are homogeneous in terms of religion, that they're all Muslims. The truth is far different. There are many Christians throughout this part of the world. There are many Jews, and there are many Zoroastrians in places like Iran. There is religious diversity here. Now, why did Arab nationalism and later Islamism kind of dominate from the 50s to the 60s and later in the 70s? Why was this the case? Well, in the aftermath of colonialism, there were a lot of social movements that emerged and new governments that wanted to try to create political unity across these countries to resist European influence and build new nation states. So those governments promoted national unity. But as the memories of colonialism, as they start to fade a bit, And as growing opposition to these regimes begins to emerge from the 1970s to the 2000s, we begin to see greater support for multiculturalism and diversity. And this idea that it's okay to have difference. Okay, so for example, we see a lot of ethnic-based social movements supported by these NGOs and IGOs. Some of these movements, for example, represented this linguistic minority known as the Amazigh in North Africa, in countries like Morocco and Algeria. In Morocco, about half the country speaks the Amazigh language. Furthermore, in Algeria, about a quarter of the population speaks Amazigh. For example, a group of activists in 2005 in Morocco formed the Moroccan Amazigh Democratic Party. We see emergence of a number of NGOs and political parties in these countries that promoted the preservation of the Amazigh language, the use of Amazigh in the media and in with political discourse, and the use of Amazigh as well in the educational system. And on top of that as well, many Amazigh activists wanted the redistribution of wealth to their more marginalized regions of the country. So this was a big example here of a multicultural movement. And of course, you notice the term Democratic Party, right? They're supporting democracy and pluralism in their country, these liberal multicultural movements. And we also see amongst many Kurdish activists something similar emerge here in Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. So, for example, in northern Iraq, we see the emergence of the Kurdish Democratic Party that supported democracy and the rights of the Kurds in this country. And of course, they were against the oppression they experienced under Saddam Hussein from the late 70s up until when he was overthrown in 2003. And these groups, what they had in common is they supported language preservation and greater autonomy for their groups within these societies. And it wasn't just ethnic or religious minorities that were engaged in these movements. There were also, for example, feminist movements that emerged during this era, promoting the spread of secularism as well as women's rights throughout the region from the 1970s to the 2000s. So over time, the number of these movements emerged. One great example of this is the Tunisian Association for Democratic Women in 1989. Initially, under the Ben Ali regime, there was a very brief period where Ben Ali was allowing a little bit more freedom for NGOs and political parties to merge. And during this brief window, you begin to see groups like this come into being. Now, a little later, he's going to crack down a lot of these movements by the early to late 90s. But in this short time period, there was a growing space for activism. So overall, with these NGOs, these states use a mix of repression and co-optation. In some instances, they allowed these NGOs to mobilize, and other times, when they found that they were threats to the regime, they would sometimes imprison these activists. Now, by the way, just to kind of dig into this Amazigh issue here, this is a linguistic minority in North Africa, as you can see on this map. This is where the Amazigh minorities are located. They really are more of a collection of interrelated languages. There are, approximately a dozen of them spread out across North Africa, mainly in Morocco, Algeria, in Libya, and a few other places in the region. There are even a few located in sub-Saharan Africa, like Mali and Niger. So we have some diversity in these parts of the world. I talked about that as well in a prior lecture with the Kurds, right? So not everybody in the Middle East speaks Arabic, and there are even a few countries where the majority do not speak Arabic, such as Turkey, Iran, and Israel. And so here, this is the Moroccan Amazigh Democratic Party, just giving you an example here of language and cultural preservation. Things like music, for example, are a great way to preserve one's cultural heritage. And this, by the way, is the Amazigh flag. There are some activists that want autonomy, even a few that have called for separatism. And this has sometimes led to crackdowns in regimes in places like Morocco and Algeria. Now, one last thing here. By the 2000s, it became increasingly obvious to activists that even peaceful NGO activism would not be enough. The fact was that the regimes were really starting to crack down on these movements, and there was growing frustration along with growing support for democracy. So by the 2000s, they became involved in more aggressive tactics. We begin to see the growth of protest movements within these electoral authoritarian regimes. Number one, there was a disappointment with a lack of full democratic transition. But number two, what we also see happen in the 2000s is growing access to the internet and social media. What this enabled activists to do is to create protest movements online under the noses of dictatorships and to organize protests during this era. Now, on top of this, we begin to see more activists refuse to participate in elections. Many of them refuse to be co-opted into these regimes, and many of them began to boycott elections and engage in mass protests. One example of this is the Kafaya movement in Egypt. Kafaya is Arabic for enough. In 2004, a group of activists began to engage in protests, and there was a severe crackdown on this movement. Many of these activists were arrested, some were sent into exile. So that's one example of this. We also as well begin to see a lot of secular liberals and Muslim Democrats overcome some of their differences and begin to form coalitions. As many Muslim Democrats begin to moderate their behavior, they began to form coalitions with secular liberals. So, for example, in Egypt, you had many members of the Muslim Brotherhood and the New Wafd. They started to boycott the 2010 elections when they realized how severely these elections were going to be rigged. So this is an example of, you start to see the formation of these large coalitions in favor of democracy. Now, these regimes began to respond with crackdowns as a consequence, and we begin to see the increased use of police repression as support for these regimes decline. And initially, a lot of these regimes began to justify it using the war on terror. Often they would try to target Islamists to justify this type of crackdown. But over time, they even began to crack down on liberals. And as a consequence of these growing crackdowns, this increased the anger towards these regimes and the frustration as many more protesters and journalists ended up in prisons by the late 2000s. An example of how this was used was in Egypt with Mubarak's emergency laws. When Anwar Sadat was assassinated in 1981, his predecessor by a radical Islamist, his successor Mubarak initiated these emergency laws, which basically enabled his regime to arrest anybody on suspicion of quote unquote terrorism or destabilizing national unity or security. And as a consequence, a lot of peaceful activists got arrested using this emergency law, and they got put into prisons. Some of them were put on trial by military courts as opposed to civilian courts. And we see in many other countries throughout the region the use of similar emergency laws to crack down on peaceful protests. And this allowed for the arbitrary arrest of activists on the basis of national security. Now, many of these activists were sent into a prison or exile, but many continued to operate underground, and they would find various creative ways to hold protests despite the increasing repression. Some, for example, would for example, seek a permit to hold a protest on something the regime would allow them to protest on. So, for example, sometimes these regimes would allow protests on issues such as what was going on in Israel and Palestine, or they would allow them to protest on the US occupation of Iraq. But what would happen is when these people went out to protest, as opposed to protesting the occupation of Iraq, they would hold up signs saying, "Down with the regime." This is what the Kafaya movement did in 2004. So they were supposed to protest the occupation of Iraq, and instead they started holding up signs that said, "La le Mubarak," no to Mubarak, down with his regime. So we see this here. This means here, this little, this Arabic here means kafaya. It means enough, right? Enough with the political repression. I really like this political cartoon here that really reflects the Kafaya movement. So it comes from Egypt. Now, of course, Egypt has a history that predates Islam. During the days of the pharaohs, during the days of ancient Egypt, it was the pharaoh that ruled Egypt as a god, right? And here the pharaoh is depicted, okay, as representing Hosni Mubarak, because above the pharaoh's head is, this phrase martial law, because President Hosni Mubarak was severely repressing the opposition and fixing elections. And of course, he's represented as the god Horus, who during ancient Egypt was the god of that represented the pharaohs, the living pharaoh. And Horus here, he's holding a machine gun, okay? Now, at the other side of the political cartoon is the god Osiris, the god of the dead. And this is supposed to represent militant terrorists. And so on the far right, we've got the Salafist jihadists. They're also holding a weapon. And in the center, represented by the goddess Isis, she represents the protesters. We can see here Kafaya, those who support democracy. And I think because it's, a feminist god, right? A lot of these protesters were born in feminism. This was a way to represent the pro-democracy protesters. So as a consequence of this, what we have in the Middle East, particularly amongst the Arab republics, is this growing support for democracy. And regimes that initially tried to respond to it by loosening controls of the system, by the 2000s, they began to reverse this and increase their crackdowns. And this is going to create a kind of powder keg. As they try to crack down on the opposition, this is going to lead to growing grievances with these regimes. And eventually, it's going to explode into a revolution. Okay, so next lecture, I'm going to present some other reasons for this revolution. We're going to talk about the economic aspects of the revolution. We will talk about that next time. I will see you all there.